In the harsh Colorado territory of 1885, 7-year-old Emma Sullivan clutched the weathered hand of the mountain woman everyone called Magdalene. The entire village had gathered for the monthly supply exchange, but Emma's words cut through the crowd like winter wind. "Take my father," she pleaded, her voice clear and determined. "He works hard and never complains." The child's innocence struck like lightning through the assembled settlers. Her father, Thomas Sullivan, stood frozen in mortification, while Magdalene's steel-grey eyes searched the little girl's face. For 3 years, since Emma's mother died in childbirth, Thomas had struggled alone, working dawn to dusk just to keep food on their table. The mountain woman was known for her healing herbs and fierce independence, living in solitude high above the valley. No one had ever seen her show interest in town affairs, much less in taking care of a widowed farmer and his child. But what drove a desperate child to make such an extraordinary request? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I saved something extra special for you. Magdalene's fingers tightened around the worn leather pouch that hung at her waist, feeling the familiar bulge of dried herbs and carefully prepared remedies within. The child's words echoed in her mind as she studied the small face before her, searching for any hint of jest or childish fancy. But Emma Sullivan's brown eyes held only earnest hope and a wisdom that seemed far beyond her 7 years. The crowd around them had fallen into an uncomfortable silence, waiting to see how the mountain woman would respond to such an unprecedented request. Magdalene had lived in these parts for nearly 15 years, and in all that time she had maintained careful distance from the valley's domestic affairs. She came down from her cabin only when someone desperately needed her healing knowledge, or during these monthly exchanges when she traded her herbs and remedies for essential supplies. She remembered the first time she had seen this territory, riding through the mountain passes with nothing but her horse, her medical supplies, and a heart so broken she thought it might never heal. That was 1870, when the Colorado Territory was even wilder and more unforgiving than it was now. She had been running from a life that had crumbled around her, seeking solitude in the high places where memories might not follow so closely. The tragedy that had driven her to the mountains was not something she allowed herself to think about often. Her husband Charles had been a doctor in Denver, and she had worked alongside him, learning everything he could teach her about healing and medicine. They had been planning to start a family when the cholera outbreak of 1869 swept through the city like a sigh. Charles had insisted on treating the sick in the poorest neighborhoods, despite the danger. He had died within 3 days of showing symptoms, and Magdalene had watched helplessly as her knowledge proved insufficient to save the man she loved most. The guilt and grief had nearly destroyed her. She had blamed herself for not being skilled enough, for not recognizing the signs sooner, for failing when it mattered most. The other doctors in Denver had tried to convince her to stay, to continue Charles's work, but she could not bear to practice medicine in the shadow of her greatest failure. So she had gathered what supplies she could carry and ridden into the mountains, seeking a place where she could disappear from the world that had taken everything from her. But isolation had proved impossible to maintain completely. The mountain folk and valley settlers had needs that her knowledge could address, and despite her desire for solitude, she found herself unable to turn away from genuine suffering. A rancher's wife with a difficult childbirth, a logger with a badly infected wound, children burning with fever their parents could not break. Gradually, reluctantly, she had become the region's unofficial doctor, accepting payment in goods and supplies rather than coin. Now she looked down at Emma Sullivan and saw something that stirred feelings she had thought long buried. The child had the same determined set to her jaw that Magdalene remembered from her own younger self, the same refusal to accept defeat that had driven her to learn everything Charles could teach her about healing. But there was also a vulnerability in Emma's eyes, a need for protection and guidance that touched something deep in Magdalene's carefully guarded heart. Thomas Sullivan stood a few paces away, his face red with embarrassment and something that might have been panic. Magdalene had observed him during previous exchanges, noting the careful way he counted his meager coins, the worn condition of his clothes, the tired lines around his eyes that spoke of too much work and too little rest. He was younger than she was, probably no more than 30, but he carried himself with the weariness of a much older man. She had heard the story, of course. How his wife had died giving birth to their second child, who had lived only a few hours. How Thomas had been left alone with Emma, struggling to manage both farm work and child-rearing, with no help except what neighbors could occasionally spare. The farm was small and the soil difficult, yielding just enough to keep them fed, but never enough to provide security or comfort. Looking at them now, father and daughter, both worn thin by hardship, but still maintaining their dignity, Magdalene felt something shift inside her chest. Perhaps it was time to stop running from connection, to consider whether healing might include more than just treating physical ailments. "Child," she said finally, her voice carrying the authority that came from years of making life and death decisions, "why do you think I should take your father?" Thomas Sullivan's worn work gloves felt heavy in his hands as he sat on the edge of his narrow bed, staring at the patch of moonlight that fell across the rough wooden floor. Emma had been asleep for an hour, but sleep eluded him as thoroughly as prosperity had for the past 3 years. The gloves were a testament to his endless labor, patched with scraps of leather where the original material had worn through, restitched so many times that more thread than original fabric held them together. Every morning before dawn, he pulled on these gloves and walked out to face another day of backbreaking work. The Sullivan farm comprised 40 acres of stubborn Colorado soil that seemed determined to resist his effort. The previous owner had warned him about the challenges, but Thomas had been young and optimistic then, certain that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle. Sarah had believed in him, had stood beside him as they'd walked the property boundaries and planned where to build their house, where to plant crops, where to raise the children they'd dreamed of having. The memory of that day still cut deep. Sarah had been barely 19, her dark hair catching sunlight as she pointed toward a gentle slope and declared it the perfect spot for a vegetable garden. "Our children will help us tend it," she had said, laughing as she spun in a circle with her arms outstretched. "We'll teach them that food tastes better when you've grown it yourself." 3 years later she was gone, and the garden spot remained unplanted. Thomas rose and walked to the small window that looked out over his property. The barn needed new shingles before winter. The fence along the north pasture was leaning badly and the well pump had been making worrying sounds for weeks. Each repair required money he didn't have, time he couldn't spare, or skills he'd never acquired. He had learned farming through trial and error, making costly mistakes that a more experienced man might have avoided. The truth was that Emma's public declaration had embarrassed him precisely because it contained so much truth. He did work hard without complaint, but that work was barely enough to keep them fed and sheltered. The ledger in the general store showed mounting debt that grew larger each month, despite his best efforts. Winter clothes for Emma, medicine when she'd been sick with fever, seed for spring planting, all of it added up to an obligation he wasn't sure he could meet. His wife's simple gold wedding band rested in his shirt pocket, where he'd carried it every day since her death. He had removed it from her finger with trembling hands, unable to leave it in the ground, but equally unable to wear it himself. Sometimes he took it out and held it up to the light, remembering how it had looked on Sarah's hand, how she had twisted it when she was thinking or worried. Sarah would have known how to handle Emma's bold request. She would have found a way to discuss it that preserved everyone's dignity while addressing the very real needs that had prompted it. Thomas felt clumsy and inadequate when it came to the emotional complexities of raising a daughter. He could teach Emma practical skills, could show her how to tend animals and recognize weather patterns, but the subtle requirements of a young girl's heart often left him feeling helpless. Earlier that evening, after they'd returned from town and completed their chores, Emma had sat beside him on the porch steps and asked why he seemed upset about her conversation with Magdalene. "Papa, did I do something wrong?" she had asked, her small hand finding his. I thought you might like to have help with everything. You get so tired. How could he explain to a 7-year-old that her perceptive kindness had exposed his failures as a provider, that her innocent solution to their problems highlighted just how desperate their situation had become? He had pulled her close and told her that she was a good girl who only wanted to help, but that grown-up decisions were complicated in ways she didn't understand yet. I know you work hard, Papa, she had whispered against his shoulder. Harder than anybody. Magdalene seemed nice, and she knows about healing things. Maybe she could help heal the sad parts too. The sad parts. Emma's simple phrase captured something Thomas couldn't have articulated himself. Yes, there were sad parts that went beyond practical challenges, wounds that had nothing to do with finances or farm management. The loneliness that crept in during quiet moments, the weight of making every decision alone, the fear that he wasn't enough for the child who depended on him completely. Now, in the privacy of darkness, Thomas could admit to himself that Emma's bold request hadn't been entirely unwelcome. The mountain woman had seemed different from what he'd expected, less forbidding and more thoughtful. Her question about why Emma thought she should take him had been direct, but not unkind, and there had been something in her eyes that suggested genuine consideration rather than dismissal. Perhaps tomorrow he would find the courage to ride up the mountain path and continue the conversation his daughter had started. The general store buzzed with conversation the morning after the supply exchange, voices rising and falling like the hum of industrious bees as customers lingered longer than usual over their purchases. Martha Hendricks, the storekeeper's wife, kept one ear tuned to every conversation while she tallied numbers in the thick ledger that recorded the community's debts and credits. Well, I never, declared Mrs. Abernethy, adjusting her black bonnet as she leaned across the counter. In all my days I've never heard such a forward request from a child, and directed at that woman of all people. Her companion, Mrs. Fletcher, nodded vigorously while selecting fabric from the bolt goods. Someone should have taught that child proper manners. A lady doesn't make such personal arrangements in public, regardless of her circumstances. But not all the talk carried disapproval. Near the pickle barrel, two younger women whispered with something closer to sympathy. Poor little thing, murmured Jane Collins, bouncing her infant son on her hip. She's just trying to take care of her papa the only way she knows how. Children see things simply sometimes. Thomas Sullivan's a good man, caught in hard circumstances, agreed Mary Watson, her voice dropping lower. Lost his wife so young, trying to manage everything alone. Maybe the child has wisdom the rest of us lack. Martha's attention shifted to the ledger page marked with Thomas Sullivan's name. The columns showed a steady accumulation of debt over the past 6 months. Seed corn, winter flour, medicine for Emma's fever, new boots when the child's feet had grown. Each entry was modest, but together they painted a picture of a family stretched beyond their means. Near the door, 3 ranchers discussed the situation with the practical assessment of men who understood land and livestock. 40 acres of that soil would challenge an experienced farmer, observed Jim Peterson, stroking his grey beard. Sullivan's learned a lot in 3 years, but learning costs money he doesn't have. The mountain woman knows her business, though, added Frank Morrison. Fixed my mare's leg when the bone surgeon wanted to put her down. Whatever else folks say about her, she's got knowledge worth respecting. Strange woman, though, muttered the third man, Bill Crawford. Lives up there alone like some kind of hermit. Hardly natural for a woman her age. The conversation paused as the store's bell chimed, announcing the arrival of Reverend Matthew. The portly minister's presence immediately shifted the tone of discussions, as it usually did. His disapproval of irregular arrangements was well known throughout the community. I trust we're not encouraging unseemly behavior, he said, his voice carrying the authority of moral judgment. A child making such declarations, a man considering such unconventional arrangements. There are proper ways to address hardship, and they don't involve compromising Christian values. Martha found herself bristling at the Reverend's tone. She had seen too many families struggle in silence, rather than seek help, that might raise eyebrows among the more judgmental members of the community. The Sullivan Ledger told a story of quiet desperation that church charity had not adequately addressed. Sometimes desperation drives people to consider options they wouldn't normally entertain, she said carefully, her pen poised over the ledger. Maybe we should ask ourselves why a child felt compelled to make such a request, instead of criticizing her for making it. The Reverend's eyebrows rose at her implied criticism. Are you suggesting the community has failed in its Christian duty, Mrs. Hendricks? Before Martha could respond, the door chimed again, admitting Dr. Brennan, the traveling physician who visited their settlement monthly. His weathered medical bag marked him as someone whose opinion carried weight in matters of practical concern. I couldn't help overhearing, he said, setting his bag on the counter. I've had occasion to consult with the mountain woman about various cases. Her knowledge of healing herbs and practical medicine exceeds that of many trained physicians. I've encountered, if Thomas Sullivan is considering an arrangement with her, he could do far worse. This professional endorsement surprised several listeners. Dr. Brennan was not given to frivolous praise, and his respect for Magdalene's abilities added a new dimension to the community's assessment. But what about propriety? Persisted Mrs. Abernathy. What about setting appropriate examples for our children? What about survival? Countered Dr. Brennan. I've seen that child's health records. She's been sick 3 times this winter because their house isn't adequately heated. I've treated Thomas for exhaustion and malnutrition disguised as minor ailments. Sometimes survival trumps convention. The store fell quiet as people absorbed this sobering assessment. Martha looked again at the Sullivan Ledger entry, seeing beyond the numbers to the human struggle they represented. Outside, Emma Sullivan walked past the store window on her way to school, her small hand clutching a lunch pail that probably contained less food than it should. Several people inside noticed her, and the sight of the child who had sparked such discussion seemed to settle something in their collective conscience. Maybe, said Jane Collins softly, we should be asking how we can help instead of whether we approve. Thomas was mending fence wire behind the barn when he heard the distinctive sound of horse hooves on the rocky path that led to his farm. He straightened, shielding his eyes against the afternoon sun, and felt his breath catch when he recognized the rider approaching. Magdalene sat astride a sturdy bay mare, her hand-carved walking stick secured beside her saddle, moving with the easy confidence of someone who had spent years navigating mountain trails. She rode directly toward him, her steel-gray hair braided back beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen many seasons of weather. Her riding dress was practical dark wool, well-made but without ornamentation, and her boots showed the scuffs and wear of someone who spent most of her time outdoors. As she drew closer, Thomas could see the leather medicine pouch hanging from her belt, its surface smooth from years of handling. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, reining in her horse a respectful distance away. Her voice carried the same steady authority he remembered from the supply exchange, but there was something softer in her expression now, less guarded than it had been in the public setting. "Ma'am," Thomas replied, setting down his wire cutters and pulling off his work gloves. "I wasn't expecting, that is, I hope nothing's wrong." "Nothing urgent," Magdalene assured him, dismounting with fluid grace despite her years. "I came to see your farm, to understand what your daughter was offering when she made her request." The directness of her statement caught Thomas off guard. He had imagined various scenarios for how this conversation might unfold, but he hadn't expected such straightforward acknowledgement of Emma's proposition. "She's a good child," he said carefully, "but sometimes her eagerness to help leads her to speak without thinking through the complication." Magdalene tied her horse to the fence post and looked around the property with the assessing gaze of someone who understood both land management and human struggle. She noted the patched barn roof, the vegetable garden that showed more weeds than crops, the chickens scratching in a yard that needed better fencing. "May I look around?" she asked. "I'd like to see what you've built here." Thomas nodded, falling into step beside her as she walked toward the house. He found himself seeing his property through her eyes, noting deficiencies he'd grown accustomed to overlooking. The front steps needed repair, the kitchen garden was poorly organized, and the well pump that had been making concerning noises chose that moment to emit a particularly ominous grinding sound. The pump's been acting up, he said, embarrassed by the timing. I've been meaning to take it apart and see what's wrong. Magdalene paused at the well, listening to the mechanical protests. Sounds like the leather washers are worn. Do you have replacement parts? No. I was hoping to nurse it through until spring, when I might have money for repairs. She nodded without judgment, continuing her circuit of the property. At the vegetable garden, she knelt and picked up a handful of soil, testing its texture between her fingers. Clay base with poor drainage, she observed, but good mineral content. It could be productive with proper amendment and planning. Thomas watched her systematic evaluation, impressed by her knowledge and oddly comforted by her practical approach. She wasn't offering charity or pity, just honest assessment of problems that had solutions. Your daughter mentioned that you work hard and never complain, Magdalene said, straightening and brushing soil from her hands. I can see evidence of the hard work. The complaining part, well, I imagine you do that privately. The gentle humor in her voice surprised him into almost smiling. Emma sees more than she should sometimes. Children often do. They haven't learned yet that some truths are supposed to remain unspoken. They walked toward the house, and Thomas felt compelled to explain, to justify the obvious signs of struggle she was documenting. I know it's not much to look at right now. Sarah and I had plans, but when she died, plans change, Magdalene said simply. The question is whether you're ready to make new ones. From inside the house came the sound of Emma's voice, singing softly to herself as she worked on some task. The melody drifted through the thin walls, sweet and innocent, and both adults paused to listen. She's a remarkable child, Magdalene said. Old enough to recognize genuine need, brave enough to ask for help, wise enough to see past surface appearances to character underneath. She liked you immediately, Thomas admitted. Emma's usually shy around strangers, but something about you put her at ease. Children sense authenticity. They haven't learned to be impressed by pretense or frightened by unconventional choices. Magdalene's walking stick, carved from mountain oak and worn smooth by years of use, tapped gently against the porch steps as she examined the house's foundation. Thomas found himself watching her hands, noting their strength and competence, the way they moved with practiced efficiency, whether examining soil or testing structural stability. Mr. Sullivan, she said finally, turning to face him directly. Your daughter asked me to take you. I'm here to propose that we take each other. The morning after Magdalene moved into the small guest room off the kitchen, Emma woke before dawn with an excitement she hadn't felt since Christmas morning. She clutched her handmade doll, a raggedy creation of fabric scraps and yarn that had been her constant companion since her mother's death, and crept quietly to the kitchen, where she could hear soft sounds of someone moving about. Magdalene stood at the stove, dressed in a simple grey dress with her sleeves rolled up, stirring something that smelled wonderfully of cinnamon and nutmeg. A pot of coffee sent steam curling toward the ceiling, and the kitchen felt warmer and more welcoming than it had in months. Good morning, little one, Magdalene said without turning around. You're an early riser. How did you know it was me? Emma whispered, not wanting to wake her father. Different people make different sounds when they walk. You step light and quick, like a sparrow. Magdalene turned with a smile that transformed her usually serious face. Are you hungry? Emma nodded eagerly, settling into her usual chair at the kitchen table. She watched in fascination as Magdalene moved efficiently around the small space, seeming to know instinctively where everything belonged, despite having been there less than 12 hours. What are you making? Porridge with apples and spices, my grandmother's recipe. Magdalene ladled the steaming mixture into a bowl and set it before Emma, along with a small pitcher of cream that must have come from her own supplies. She used to say that breakfast should be both nourishment and comfort. Emma took a tentative bite, and her eyes widened with pleasure. The porridge was creamy and sweet, nothing like the plain oatmeal she and her father usually managed for breakfast. It's wonderful, she breathed. Magdalene's smile deepened as she poured herself a cup of coffee and sat across from Emma at the table. I'm glad you like it. I was hoping we might establish some new routines that would work well for all of us. Will you stay forever? Emma asked, the question tumbling out before she could stop it. "We're going to try this arrangement for a month," Magdalene said gently, "to see if we all suit each other. Change is difficult, even when it's for the better." Emma considered this while eating another spoonful of the delicious porridge. "Papa's been sad for a long time. I think he forgot how to be happy." "Grief takes time to heal," Magdalene said, "but sometimes new experiences can help us remember that happiness is still possible." Thomas appeared in the doorway, his hair tousled from sleep and his expression uncertain. He'd clearly been awakened by the unfamiliar sounds and smells, and Emma could see him taking in the transformed kitchen, the comfortable domesticity that Magdalene's presence had already created. "Good morning," Magdalene said, rising to pour him coffee. "I hope you don't mind that I started breakfast. I'm an early riser by habit." "No, it smells wonderful," Thomas said, accepting the cup gratefully. Emma noticed how his fingers lingered when they brushed against Magdalene's as she handed him the coffee, and how quickly he pulled back as if he'd been burned. "Magdalene made the best porridge ever," Emma announced. "Better than Mama's even." Thomas's face tightened at the comparison, and Emma immediately realized her mistake. She hadn't meant to suggest replacement or comparison, only to express her delight in this new experience. "I'm sure your mama made excellent porridge," Magdalene said smoothly, settling back into her chair. "Every cook has their own special touch. I simply use the spices I gather from the mountain meadows." The gentle response seemed to ease Thomas's discomfort, and he accepted a bowl of the porridge with mumbled thanks. Emma watched anxiously as he tasted it, hoping he would appreciate Magdalene's cooking as much as she did. "It's very good," he said finally, and Emma relaxed. "Thank you." As they ate together, Magdalene outlined her thoughts about organizing their daily routine. She would handle most of the cooking and household tasks, freeing Thomas to focus on farm work and repairs. Emma would continue with her schooling, but could help with simple chores and learn domestic skills that would serve her well in the future. "I'd also like to establish a proper kitchen garden," Magdalene said. "That soil behind the house could produce vegetables enough to feed us well, plus surplus for preserving and trading." Thomas nodded, looking relieved at her practical approach. "I've never had much success with vegetables. Seems like I can keep the corn and wheat growing, but the garden crops always struggle." "Different plants have different needs," Magdalene explained, "and timing is crucial. I've learned which varieties thrive in mountain conditions and when to plant for best success." Emma listened to this adult conversation with growing excitement. The idea of fresh vegetables from their own garden, of meals like this wonderful breakfast every day, of having a woman's presence and guidance in the house again, filled her with hope she'd almost forgotten how to feel. After breakfast, as Thomas prepared for his morning chores and Emma gathered her school things, Magdalene walked through the house with the eye of someone planning improvements. The rooms were clean but sparse, furnished with only the most essential items and lacking the small touches that made a house feel like a home. Emma's room was particularly austere, containing only a narrow bed, a small chest for clothes, and a wooden crate that served as both chair and storage for her few possessions. The raggedy doll sat prominently on the pillow, its mismatched button eyes and yarn hair testament to a child's need for comfort in the absence of maternal care. By the end of their first week together, the small farmhouse had settled into rhythms that felt both strange and natural to its 3 inhabitants. Thomas found himself waking each morning to the scent of coffee already brewing and breakfast preparations underway, luxuries he'd almost forgotten existed. But along with gratitude came an uncomfortable awareness that his ordered solitude had been permanently disrupted. Magdalene had discovered Sarah's recipe book tucked away in a kitchen drawer, its pages filled with his late wife's careful handwriting and margin notes about ingredient substitutions and cooking times. She'd asked permission before opening it, treating the worn volume with the respect due to something precious, but Thomas had seen her studying the recipes with an intensity that made him wonder what conclusions she was drawing. "Your wife was a thoughtful cook," Magdalene observed one evening as she prepared supper. "These notes show real understanding of how ingredients work together." Thomas nodded, uncertain how to respond. The recipe book had been too painful to use after Sarah's death, but seeing Magdalene reference it felt like watching his past and present collide in ways he wasn't prepared to handle. She learned from her mother, he said finally. Always said cooking was about love as much as skill. She was right about that, Magdalene agreed, adding herbs to the pot of stew that would feed them for several days. Food prepared with care nourishes more than just the body. Emma bounced into the kitchen at that moment, her school slate tucked under one arm, and her raggedy doll clutched in the other hand. She'd taken to including the doll in more activities since Magdalene's arrival, as if the woman's presence had made it safe to be more openly childlike. "Magdalene, will you help me with my arithmetic?" Emma asked. "Mrs. Henderson gave us problems about measuring ingredients for cooking, and I thought you might know better than Papa." Thomas felt a small sting at the casual assumption that Magdalene would be more helpful than he was, even though the assessment was probably accurate. His own education had been practical rather than extensive, focused on skills needed for farming and basic commerce. "Of course," Magdalene said, wiping her hands on her apron. "But I think your Papa might surprise you with what he knows about measurements. Farming requires quite a lot of mathematical calculation." The gentle way she redirected Emma's comment, giving Thomas credit while still offering help, struck him as typically thoughtful. Over the past week, he'd noticed how carefully Magdalene navigated the delicate territory of an established family, offering support without overstepping boundaries he hadn't even realized he'd drawn. After Emma had gone to bed, Thomas and Magdalene often found themselves sharing the quiet evening hours in the main room. She with some mending or herb preparation, he with account books or tools that needed attention. These were the times when conversation flowed most easily, when the formal politeness of daytime interactions gave way to something more genuine. "You've been very patient with our routines," Thomas said one such evening, looking up from the harness he was repairing. "I know this arrangement can't be easy for you either." Magdalene set down the torn shirt she was mending and considered his words. "I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed domestic life," she admitted. "Living alone for so many years, I'd convinced myself that solitude was preferable to the complications of shared living. But there's satisfaction in cooking for people who appreciate the effort, in making a house feel like a home again." "Emma's certainly happier," Thomas observed. "She talks constantly about things you've taught her. Songs you've hummed while working, stories you've told about plants and healing. She's a bright child, hungry for knowledge and attention. She reminds me of myself at that age, always asking questions and wanting to understand how things work." Thomas found himself studying Magdalene's profile in the lamplight, noting the strength in her features and the way her hands moved with practiced competence, even while engaged in conversation. She was an attractive woman. He realized with some surprise, though her beauty was of the practical, enduring sort rather than the delicate femininity he'd been drawn to in Sarah. "What were you like as a child?" he asked, surprising himself with the personal question. Magdalene smiled, her expression softening with memory. "Stubborn and curious, much to my mother's despair. I wanted to learn everything my father knew about farming and everything my grandmother knew about healing. I couldn't understand why some knowledge was considered appropriate for girls and some wasn't." "Is that how you learned medicine?" "Partly. My grandmother taught me about herbs and traditional remedies, but I learned more formal medical knowledge later when I married a doctor." He grew quieter. He believed that healing was too important to be limited by convention. Thomas heard the past tense and the subtle shift in her tone, recognizing the careful way people spoke of losses they'd learned to carry but not overcome. He wanted to ask more to understand the experiences that had shaped her, but sensed that such questions would require more trust than they'd yet established. Instead, he returned to his harness repair while she resumed her mending, both of them comfortable in the shared silence that had become one of the unexpected pleasures of their arrangement. The barometer in Magdalene's bedroom had been dropping steadily for 2 days, its brass needle pointing toward the storm, warning that her mountain-trained instincts had already detected in the changing wind patterns and the restless behavior of the farm animals. She'd learned to read weather signs during her years in the high country, where sudden storms could mean the difference between life and death for anyone caught unprepared. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened to an ominous grey-green that spoke of serious weather approaching. Thomas was in the barn securing loose equipment and checking on the livestock, while Emma helped Magdalene prepare the house for what promised to be a significant storm. They filled every available container with water from the well, brought in extra firewood, and moved the oil lamps to easily accessible locations. "Will it be very bad?" Emma asked, pressing her face to the kitchen window to watch the wind bend the trees into impossible angles. "Bad enough that we'll be grateful to be warm and dry inside," Magdalene replied, testing the latches on the shutters. "Mountain storms can be fierce, but they usually pass quickly if you're properly prepared." The first drops of rain arrived just as Thomas returned from the barn, his coat collar turned up against the wind that was now howling around the corners of the house. Within minutes, the gentle pattering had become a drumming downpour that drove against the windows with increasing force. "Animals are secured," Thomas reported, hanging his wet coat by the door. "But that roof leak over the back bedroom is going to be a problem if this keeps up." As if summoned by his words, the sound of dripping began from the direction he'd indicated. Magdalene quickly gathered pots and bowls to catch the water, while Emma helped position them under the worst spots. The small house seemed to contract around them as the storm's fury intensified, creating an intimacy that their careful daily routines had not yet achieved. Thunder began as a distant rumble but quickly grew closer and more violent, shaking the house with each crash. Emma, who had been maintaining a brave front, finally succumbed to fear when a particularly loud boom seemed to split the sky directly overhead. She ran to Magdalene, burying her face against the woman's skirt with a muffled cry. "It's all right, little one," Magdalene soothed, stroking Emma's hair. "Storms sound fiercer than they are when you're safely inside." Thomas watched this interaction with mixed emotions. Part of him was grateful to see Emma receiving the maternal comfort he couldn't provide, but another part felt displaced, as if his role as sole protector and comforter was being usurped. Magdalene seemed to sense his conflicted feelings and gently guided Emma toward him. "Your papa's the one who made sure we'd be safe and dry," she said. "He secured the barn and brought in everything we'd need. That takes real courage and knowledge." Emma looked up at Thomas with renewed admiration, and he felt some of his tension ease. Magdalene had a gift for including rather than replacing, for strengthening family bonds rather than competing with them. As the storm raged outside, they found themselves drawn together in the main room, the largest space with the most reliable roof. Magdalene prepared a simple supper that could be eaten without requiring trips to the kitchen, while Thomas tended the fire that would need to burn all night to keep them warm and dry. "Tell us about mountain storms," Emma requested, settled between the two adults with her doll tucked safely in her arms. "Are they different from valley storms?" Magdalene's eyes took on the distant look of someone accessing carefully stored memories. "Mountains make their own weather," she began. "The peaks catch clouds and squeeze the moisture out of them, sometimes with very little warning. I once saw snow falling in bright sunshine, and I've watched storms build from nothing to dangerous in less than an hour." She told them about being caught in a blizzard during her second winter in the mountains, how she'd survived 3 days in a cave with only her horse for warmth and the supplies in her medical bag for sustenance. Thomas found himself drawn into her narrative, impressed by the courage and resourcefulness it must have taken for a woman to survive such an experience alone. "Weren't you frightened?" Emma asked. "Terrified," Magdalene admitted. "But fear can be useful if you don't let it paralyze you. It keeps you alert and focused on what needs to be done." A particularly violent gust of wind rattled the windows, and Emma instinctively moved closer to both adults. Without thinking, Thomas reached out to steady her, and his hand brushed against Magdalene's as she did the same. The contact was brief but electric, sending an unexpected jolt of awareness through him that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Magdalene seemed equally affected, her breath catching slightly before she pulled her hand back. For a moment, the air between them held a different kind of tension, one that spoke of possibilities neither had yet acknowledged aloud. The storm continued through the night, but inside the small house, three people discovered that sharing fear and comfort could create bonds stronger than any they'd previously imagined possible. The church bell's bronze voice carried across the valley every Sunday morning, calling the faithful to worship and reminding the community of its shared moral obligations. Thomas had been irregular in his attendance since Sarah's death, finding it difficult to sit in the pew where they'd shared 3 years of married life. But Magdalene's presence in his household seemed to require a return to more conventional observances. Reverend Matthews stood at the pulpit with the bearing of a man accustomed to moral authority, his sermon focusing on the proper ordering of Christian households and the dangers of unconventional arrangements. His eyes seemed to linger on the Sullivan family as they sat in their customary pew, Emma between the two adults, all three dressed in their Sunday best. "The family is the cornerstone of godly society," the Reverend intoned, his voice carrying easily through the small wooden church. "When we deviate from established patterns, when we allow convenience to override propriety, we risk not only our own souls, but the moral fabric of our community." Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks, certain that every congregant was aware of the implicit criticism directed at his living arrangement. Beside him, Magdalene sat with perfect composure, her attention apparently focused on the sermon, but he could sense the tension in her stillness. After the service, as the congregation filed out into the bright morning sunshine, the social dynamics that had been constrained during worship immediately reasserted themselves. Several families made pointed efforts to speak with Thomas, while excluding Magdalene from their conversations, creating an awkward social divide that Emma was too young to understand, but old enough to sense. "Thomas, good to see you back in church," said William Crawford, clasping Thomas's hand with exaggerated warmth. "We've missed your regular attendance." "I appreciate that, William," Thomas replied carefully, aware that Magdalene stood just behind him, technically part of their group, but effectively invisible to Crawford's acknowledgement. Mrs. Abernathy approached with her usual air of moral superiority, her black dress rustling with each step. "Mr. Sullivan, I do hope you're considering the example being set for young Emma. Children need stability and proper guidance, not irregular arrangements that might confuse their understanding of appropriate behavior." Emma, who had been listening to this adult conversation with growing bewilderment, suddenly spoke up with the clarity that only children could achieve. "Magdalene teaches me lots of things. She knows about plants and cooking and how to be brave during storms. Why wouldn't that be proper?" The directness of Emma's question created an uncomfortable silence among the adults. Mrs. Abernathy's mouth opened and closed without producing words, while several other congregants shifted uncomfortably. Magdalene stepped forward then, her voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "I understand your concerns about Emma's welfare. Any caring community member would share such concern. Perhaps you'd be interested to know that she's improved significantly in her schoolwork since I've been helping with her studies, and her health has been excellent, thanks to proper nutrition and regular routines." The challenge in Magdalene's response was politely phrased, but unmistakable. She was not a woman who would be dismissed or spoken around as if she were invisible. Dr. Brennan, who had been observing the interaction from nearby, chose that moment to join the conversation. "I can attest to the improvements Miss Magdalene mentions," he said, using the formal address that accorded her respect regardless of her marital status. "Young Emma appears healthier and more settled than I've seen her since her mother's death." His professional endorsement carried weight that even Miss Evan couldn't easily dismiss, but the social tension remained thick enough to cut with a knife. Near the church steps, another cluster of conversation had formed around some of the younger families. Mary Watson was speaking earnestly to her husband while bouncing their infant daughter on her hip. "It seems to me," Mary said, her voice carrying just far enough to be overheard, "that we should be celebrating when people find ways to care for each other instead of criticizing the methods they choose. That child has been motherless for 3 years, and now she has someone who clearly loves her." Isn't that what Christian charity looks like? Her husband nodded agreement, but others in their group looked less convinced. The community seemed genuinely divided between those who valued propriety above all else and those who prioritized practical compassion. Emma, growing tired of adult conversations she didn't fully understand, tugged on Magdalene's skirt. "Can we go home now? I want to show you the bird's nest I found yesterday." "Of course, little one," Magdalene replied, her expression softening as she looked down at the child. Birds' nests are much more interesting than grown-up talking. As they walked toward their wagon, Thomas found himself walking between his daughter and the woman who had become such an important part of their lives. The community's judgment felt heavy on his shoulders, but Emma's obvious happiness and the genuine improvements in their daily life seemed more important than social approval. Behind them the church bell fell silent, but the echoes of moral scrutiny would follow them home and into the difficult decisions that lay ahead. Thomas was organizing papers in the small desk that had belonged to Sarah when he found the faded photograph tucked between the pages of an old almanac. The image was formal, posed in the style of city portrait studios, showing a younger Magdalene in an elegant dark dress standing beside a distinguished man in a doctor's coat. Both wore wedding rings, and the woman in the photograph bore only passing resemblance to the practical mountain healer he'd come to know. He studied the image for several minutes, noting details that told a story of prosperity and social standing far removed from Magdalene's current circumstances. The dress was expensive silk, the setting suggested urban sophistication, and the man beside her radiated the confidence of professional success. This was not the past Thomas had imagined for the woman who now shared his kitchen and helped raise his daughter. Magdalene appeared in the doorway as he sat contemplating the photograph, and her sharp intake of breath told him she recognized what he'd discovered. "I wondered where that had gone," she said quietly, her voice carrying none of its usual steadiness. "I'm sorry," Thomas said, rising quickly and extending the photograph toward her. "I wasn't prying. It was just tucked in with the farm records." Magdalene accepted the photograph, but didn't look at it immediately. Instead, she sank into the chair opposite his desk, her composure finally cracking to reveal the vulnerability she usually kept so carefully hidden. "His name was Charles Whitmore," she said, her fingers tracing the edge of the photograph. "Dr. Charles Whitmore. We were married for 4 years before the cholera outbreak took him." Thomas waited, sensing that this revelation had been building since her arrival and needed to emerge at its own pace. "We lived in Denver," Magdalene continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "Charles had a practice there, mostly serving the wealthy families, but he also donated time to the charity hospital. He taught me everything he knew about medicine, said that healing was too important to be restricted by social conventions about women's roles." She looked up at Thomas then, her grey eyes holding a pain that even 15 years hadn't completely erased. "When the cholera came, he insisted on treating patients in the poorest neighborhoods, where the disease was spreading fastest. I begged him to be more careful, to limit his exposure, but he said doctors couldn't choose their patients based on personal safety." The photograph trembled slightly in her hands as the memories overwhelmed her careful control. "He became ill on a Tuesday. By Friday he was dead. All my medical knowledge, everything he'd taught me, and I couldn't save the person who mattered most." Thomas felt his chest tighten with recognition of grief that mirrored his own. "That's why you came to the mountains." "I couldn't stay in Denver. Every street corner held memories. Every patient who came to me reminded me of my failure. I sold everything, took what medical supplies I could carry, and rode until I found a place where no one knew Dr. Whitmore's wife." The silence stretched between them, heavy with shared understanding of loss and the different ways people chose to survive it. Thomas had retreated into solitary struggle, while Magdalene had sought geographic escape, but both had been shaped by the experience of watching someone they loved slip beyond their ability to help. "Emma doesn't know any of this," Magdalene said finally. "I'd prefer to keep it that way, at least for now. She's too young to understand the complexities of adult grief." "Of course," Thomas agreed, "but Magdalene, what you've told me doesn't change anything about who you are now or how much you've helped us." She looked at him with surprise, as if she'd expected judgment or rejection. I'm not the simple mountain woman people believe me to be. I had wealth, status, a completely different life. Some might say I abandoned my responsibilities when I chose isolation over continuing Charles's work. You survived, Thomas said simply. Sometimes that's the most we can manage. The understanding that passed between them in that moment was deeper than sympathy or even compassion. It was recognition of kinship forged by similar losses and the difficult work of rebuilding life after devastation. From the kitchen came the sound of Emma's voice, chattering happily to herself as she worked on some small task, oblivious to the adult conversation unfolding nearby. The normalcy of her presence seemed to pull both adults back from the edge of their shared grief. "She's been so much happier since you came," Thomas said. "Whatever your past, whatever brought you here, I'm grateful you chose to stay and help us." Magdalene carefully tucked the photograph into her apron pocket where it would remain close but hidden. "Sometimes running away leads you exactly where you need to be," she said. "I never expected to find another family to care about, another chance to use my skills for healing, rather than just surviving." Emma's laughter drifted in from the kitchen, bright and carefree, a sound that had become precious to both adults who had feared it might disappear forever. The simple pine wood ring had taken Thomas 3 evenings to carve, working by lamplight after Emma had gone to bed and Magdalene had retired to her room. He'd chosen a piece of mountain pine from his woodpile, selecting it for its fine grain and freedom from knots, then carefully shaped it with the same tools he used for farm repairs. The result was humble but honest, lacking any ornamentation except the smooth finish achieved through patient sanding. He carried the ring in his pocket for 2 days before finding the courage to speak, rehearsing words that seemed inadequate for the magnitude of what he wanted to ask. The month-long trial period had become 6 weeks, then 2 months, and none of them had mentioned the original timeline that should have ended their arrangement long ago. On a quiet evening in late autumn, with Emma absorbed in her schoolwork at the kitchen table, Thomas finally asked Magdalene to walk with him to the well where they could speak privately. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that reminded him of the hope he'd almost given up believing in. "Magdalene," he began, then stopped, overwhelmed by the importance of what he was about to say. "I need to tell you something." She waited patiently, her grey eyes reflecting the evening light, her hands folded calmly in front of her. Over the past months he'd learned to read her expressions, and he could see curiosity mixed with something that might have been anticipation. "When Emma asked you to take me, I was embarrassed," he admitted. "I thought it showed how desperate our situation had become, how badly I was failing as a father and provider." Magdalene started to protest, but he raised his hand gently, asking for permission to finish. "I was wrong," he continued. "Emma saw something I was too proud or too frightened to recognize. She saw that we needed you, yes, but she also saw that you might need us." The simple truth of his daughter's wisdom struck him anew as he spoke. Emma had approached their situation without the complications of adult pride or fear, seeing only people who could help each other and wondering why they weren't already doing so. "These months together have been the happiest I've known since Sarah died," Thomas said, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "Not just because you've made our lives easier, though you have. Not just because Emma adores you, though she does, but because you've reminded me that life can be about more than just surviving." Magdalene's expression had softened as he spoke, and he could see tears gathering in her eyes despite her attempt to maintain composure. "I know this isn't a conventional courtship," Thomas continued, pulling the pine ring from his pocket. "I know we came together through unusual circumstances, and that people will always have opinions about our arrangement. But I also know that I love you, Magdalene Whitmore, and I want to ask if you'll marry me." He held out the simple wooden ring, its surface smooth and warm from being carried close to his heart. "I can't offer you the life you had before, the wealth or status you gave up when you came to the mountains. All I can promise is honest work, faithful love, and a family that needs you as much as you've needed us." Magdalene stared at the ring for a long moment, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps as she processed what he was offering. Thomas waited, his heart hammering against his ribs, afraid that he'd misread her feelings or presumed too much about their relationship. "Thomas," she whispered finally, "I never expected to love again. I thought that part of my life ended when Charles died." Her words could have been rejection, but her tone carried wonder rather than refusal. She reached out tentatively, as if the ring might disappear if she moved too quickly. "You're offering me something I didn't know I still wanted," she continued. "A real family, a chance to build something new instead of just preserving old memories. Is that a yes?" Thomas asked, hardly daring to hope. Instead of answering with words, Magdalene extended her left hand, her fingers trembling slightly, as Thomas slipped the pine ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been carved specifically for her hand, which in every way that mattered, it had. From the house came Emma's voice calling for them, wondering what was taking so long. They turned toward the sound, and Thomas saw his daughter framed in the lamplight of the kitchen window, the child whose innocent wisdom had brought them all together. "We should tell her," Magdalene said, her voice warm with happiness and anticipation. Together, Thomas agreed, taking her hand and feeling the wooden ring press against his palm like a promise of the future they would build side by side. Magdalene's mother's quilt had survived 15 years in a cedar chest, carefully wrapped in muslin and lavender sachets to preserve its colors and protect it from mountain dampness. As she lifted it from its resting place, the familiar pattern of interlocking wedding rings seemed to shimmer in the afternoon light, filtering through her cabin windows. It was the only precious item she'd brought from her former life, too beautiful to abandon, but too painful to display until now. The quilt represented more than skilled needlework. Each ring had been pieced from fabric with meaning. Scraps from Magdalene's childhood dresses, pieces of her mother's aprons, fabric from the wedding dress she'd worn to marry Charles. Her mother had spent 2 years creating it as a wedding gift, working by candlelight after long days of farm chores, planning each color placement with the careful attention of someone creating a family heirloom. "It's beautiful," Emma breathed, running her small fingers along the intricate stitching. "Will it really be on our bed after you and Papa get married?" "If your father approves," Magdalene said, though she'd already seen Thomas's reaction when she'd shown him the quilt the evening before. His eyes had widened with appreciation for the craftsmanship, but more importantly, with understanding of what the gift represented, her willingness to share the most precious remnants of her past life with their future together. Emma had thrown herself into wedding preparations with the enthusiasm only a child could muster, treating the event as the most exciting thing that had ever happened in their small valley. She'd appointed herself chief advisor on everything from flowers to food, offering suggestions with the authority of someone who'd attended exactly 3 weddings in her entire life. "Miss Watson said we should have dancing after the ceremony," Emma announced, settling cross-legged on the floor beside the quilt. "And Mrs. Chen thinks we need at least 2 kinds of cake. But Mrs. Abernathy said simple ceremonies are more proper for people in our situation." Magdalene suppressed a smile at Emma's diplomatic reporting of neighborhood opinions. The community remained divided about their engagement, with younger families generally supportive and older, more conservative residents expressing varying degrees of disapproval. The wedding preparations had become a subtle battleground between those who valued love over convention and those who prioritized social propriety above personal happiness. "What do you think would make Papa happiest?" Magdalene asked, folding the quilt carefully and setting it aside. Emma considered this question with the seriousness she brought to all matters concerning her father's welfare. "I think he'd like it quiet and friendly," she said finally. "He gets uncomfortable when too many people are looking at him, but he'd want our real friends there, the ones who've been kind to us." The wisdom in Emma's assessment impressed Magdalene once again. The child had an intuitive understanding of her father's personality that came from years of careful observation and genuine love. Thomas appeared in the doorway then, his hair still damp from washing and his Sunday shirt carefully pressed. He'd been making an effort with his appearance since their engagement, as if his new role as prospective bridegroom required elevated attention to grooming. "Brennan stopped by," he reported. "He wanted to confirm that he'll be welcome at the ceremony. Apparently, there's been some discussion in town about the guest list." Magdalene felt a familiar tightness in her chest at the mention of community politics surrounding their wedding. She'd hoped their engagement might settle some of the controversy about their living arrangement, but instead it seemed to have intensified debates about propriety and social standards. "Of course, Dr. Brennan is welcome," she said firmly. "He's been nothing but supportive, and his professional opinion carries weight with people who might otherwise be skeptical. Reverend Matthews has agreed to perform the ceremony," Thomas continued, "though he's requested a private meeting with both of us before the wedding. He wants to discuss the responsibilities of Christian marriage and ensure we understand the seriousness of our commitment." Emma wrinkled her nose at this news. "He's going to lecture you about being proper, isn't he? Like he did in church last Sunday about people who make unconventional choices." "Probably," Thomas admitted with a rueful smile. "But getting married in the church matters to some people in the community. It might help them accept our situation more easily." Magdalene understood the political calculation behind his reasoning, even as she chafed at the necessity of seeking approval for their personal happiness. But Emma's future in this community mattered more than her own pride, and a church wedding would provide legitimacy that might protect the child from gossip and social exclusion. "Then we'll meet with Reverend Matthews and listen respectfully to his concerns, and we'll have our wedding in the church, with our friends in attendance and this quilt on our marriage bed afterward." Emma clapped her hands in delight, already envisioning the transformation of their small family into something officially recognized and celebrated by the community that had watched their unusual courtship unfold. Emma had risen before dawn to gather wild mountain flowers from the meadows above their farm, her small hands carefully selecting columbines, Indian paintbrush, and alpine forget-me-nots that would serve as Magdalene's wedding bouquet. The flowers were simple and wild, lacking the formal elegance of cultivated roses or hothouse blooms, but they carried the honest beauty of the mountain landscape that had brought them all together. The morning air held the crisp promise of autumn as the small wedding party gathered outside the valley church. Magdalene wore her one good dress, a deep blue wool that complemented her grey eyes and had been carefully altered to fit properly after years of mountain living. Her hair was braided and pinned in a style more elaborate than her usual practical arrangements, and the pine ring on her finger caught the early sunlight like a promise fulfilled. Thomas stood beside her in his Sunday suit, his hair neatly combed and his face clean-shaven for the occasion. He'd been unusually quiet that morning, not from doubt, but from the overwhelming reality that his life was about to change in ways he'd never dared to hope for during the long years of solitary struggle. The wedding guests represented a careful selection of community members who had supported their unconventional courtship. Dr. Brennan served as Thomas's witness, his medical bag set aside for once in favor of his role as friend and supporter. Mary Watson had agreed to stand with Magdalene, her own young daughter, balanced on her hip and adding to the family atmosphere of the gathering. Emma positioned herself between the bride and groom, her small hands clutching the wildflower bouquet she'd so carefully assembled. She wore her best dress, a blue calico that Magdalene had helped her alter and press for the occasion, and her hair was braided with ribbons that matched the flowers. Reverend Matthews approached the ceremony with the solemn dignity he brought to all religious observances, though those who knew him well could detect a slight softening in his usual stern demeanor. His private meeting with Thomas and Magdalene the week before had apparently satisfied his concerns about their commitment and understanding of marriage's sacred nature. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the small church, "we are gathered here today to witness the joining of Thomas Sullivan and Magdalene Whitmore in holy matrimony." The familiar words took on new meaning when applied to their specific situation. This was not a young couple beginning their adult lives together, but two people who had known loss and hardship choosing to build something new from the foundation of shared experience and mutual respect. When the time came for vows, Thomas spoke with quiet conviction about his promise to love and protect both Magdalene and Emma, to build a home where healing and happiness could flourish together. His words were simple but heartfelt, carrying the weight of genuine commitment rather than mere ritual observance. Magdalene's vows reflected her unique journey to this moment, acknowledging the unexpected gift of second chances and her determination to use her knowledge and skills in service of their new family. She promised to honor both the memory of what they'd lost and the hope of what they could create together. Emma watched the proceedings with rapt attention, understanding that this ceremony was making official something that had already become true in their daily lives. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, she clapped her hands in delight before remembering the solemnity of the church setting. The kiss that sealed their marriage was gentle and brief, appropriate for the public setting but carrying promise of private intimacies to come. As they turned to face their small gathering of witnesses, both Thomas and Magdalene were smiling with a joy that transformed their usually serious faces. Dr. Brennan was the first to offer congratulations, pumping Thomas's hand with genuine warmth and complimenting Magdalene on her choice of husband. Mary Watson embraced the new bride with tears in her eyes, whispering words of encouragement and friendship that meant more than elaborate gifts could have conveyed. Even some of the community members who had initially opposed their arrangement seemed moved by the ceremony's sincerity. Mrs. Chen, who had maintained careful neutrality throughout their courtship, approached with shy congratulations and an offer to help with the wedding dinner. As they prepared to leave the church, Emma tugged on Magdalene's skirt and whispered urgently, "Does this mean you're really my mama now?" Magdalene knelt to meet the child's eyes, her own voice voiced with emotion. "If you'd like me to be," she said, "I would be honored to be your mama, Emma Sullivan." The child's radiant smile was worth all the community controversy and social complications they'd endured to reach this moment. Outside the church, the mountain peaks stood witness to their new beginning, and the wild flowers in Emma's bouquet seemed to nod their approval in the gentle autumn breeze. The new family Bible arrived from Denver 3 weeks after the wedding, ordered specially by Thomas as a symbol of their officially united household. Its leather binding was pristine black, and the pages gleamed white and unmarked, waiting to record the important events that would shape their family's future. On the morning it arrived, Thomas carefully inscribed their marriage date in his best handwriting, followed by Emma's formal adoption as Magdalene Sullivan, making legal what had already become true in their hearts. Emma watched with fascination as her new mother's name joined her father's on the marriage registry page, and her own name was recorded with the notation "adopted daughter" in Thomas's careful script. The permanence of ink on paper seemed to make their transformation from temporary arrangement to genuine family finally and irrevocably real. "Now it's official," Emma declared with satisfaction, running her finger along the fresh entries. "Anyone who looks in this book will know we all belong together." Magdalene smiled at the child's emphasis on belonging, understanding how important that concept was to someone who had lost her birth mother so young. The adoption papers had been processed through the territorial court with surprising efficiency, helped by Dr. Brennan's testimony about Emma's improved health and happiness under Magdalene's care. The rhythm of married life had settled around them with remarkable ease, as if the formal ceremony had simply acknowledged what their daily routines had already established. Magdalene moved her belongings from the small guest room to the larger bedroom she now shared with Thomas, while Emma helped arrange furniture and personal items to accommodate their new living arrangements. The mornings began with Magdalene rising first to start coffee and breakfast preparations, followed by Thomas emerging from their shared bedroom with the slightly self-conscious air of a man still adjusting to married intimacy. Emma bounded down from her room with the energy of childhood, eager to begin each day in the security of a complete family unit. Thomas had worried that marriage might complicate their working relationship, but instead he found that official commitment had freed both of them to be more natural and affectionate. Magdalene no longer maintained the careful boundaries of a hired helper, and he no longer felt the need to guard against presuming too much about her feelings or intentions. The kitchen garden that Magdalene had planted in late spring was now producing abundantly, providing vegetables that supplemented their diet and reduced their dependence on expensive store purchases. Emma had taken particular pride in the pumpkin patch, watching the vines spread and the orange globes swell throughout the summer months. "Look how big they're getting," Emma said, kneeling beside the largest pumpkin and wrapping her arms around its circumference. "Magdalene says we can make pies and soup and even preserve some for winter eating." Thomas marveled at the transformation of their previously struggling garden plot. Under Magdalene's guidance, the same soil that had frustrated his efforts now yielded abundance that would carry them through the cold months ahead. Her knowledge of companion planting, soil amendment and proper timing had turned his gardening failures into genuine success. The financial pressures that had weighed so heavily on his shoulders were beginning to ease as well. Magdalene's medical practice brought in modest but steady income from grateful patients who paid in cash, trade goods or services. A rancher whose broken arm she'd set had repaired their barn roof without charge. A farm wife whose difficult labor she'd assisted had provided them with preserved meats and canned vegetables. "We're not just surviving anymore," Thomas observed one evening as they reviewed their household accounts. "We're actually building something sustainable." Magdalene nodded, her finger tracing the columns of income and expenses that showed their improving situation. "It's amazing what people can accomplish when they combine their strengths instead of struggling alone." Emma appeared in the doorway wearing her nightgown and carrying her raggedy doll, ready for the bedtime story that had become part of their nightly routine. This was perhaps the most precious change that marriage had brought, the luxury of unhurried family time in the evenings when all necessary work was done and they could simply enjoy each other's company. "Will you tell me about when you and Papa first met?" Emma asked, settling between them on the sofa with her doll tucked securely in her arms. It had become her favorite story, though she'd been present for the actual events. She never tired of hearing how her bold request had brought them all together, how her innocent wisdom had solved problems that the adults had been too proud or frightened to address themselves. As Magdalene began the familiar tale, Thomas looked around their lamplit room and felt the deep satisfaction of a man who had found his place in the world. The new family Bible would record many more entries in the years to come, but none would be more significant than those first 3 names that marked the beginning of their life together. The rifle had belonged to Thomas's father, a reliable Winchester that had provided meat for the family table and protection against both animal and human threats during their early years on the frontier. It hung above the fireplace mantel where Thomas could reach it quickly if needed, though in their peaceful valley such necessity seemed increasingly remote, until the morning when 3 strangers rode onto their property with the kind of casual arrogance that immediately set every survival instinct on edge. Thomas was splitting wood behind the barn when he heard unfamiliar voices from the direction of the house. He set down his axe and moved carefully toward the sound, keeping the barn between himself and the visitors until he could assess their intentions. What he saw made his blood run cold. 3 men sat their horses in front of his house, their attention focused on Magdalene, who stood on the porch with Emma slightly behind her. The men were well-armed and rough-looking, the kind of drifters who lived on the margins of civilization and respected nothing but force. The leader, a heavy-set man with graying hair and cold eyes, was speaking in tones that carried both familiarity and threat. "Dr. Magdalene Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying across the yard. "Or should I say, Mrs. Sullivan now? Word travels, even to places like this." Thomas felt his chest tighten with recognition that these men knew Magdalene's past identity, that their presence was connected to the life she'd left behind in Denver. He began moving closer, staying low and using the farm buildings for cover. "I don't know what you want," Magdalene replied, her voice steady despite the obvious danger, "but you're not welcome here." The man laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Not welcome? That's not very hospitable, considering our history together. You remember me, don't you? Magdalene. Jake Morrison from the old neighborhood?" Thomas saw Magdalene's posture stiffen with recognition, and he knew these weren't random drifters, but people from her past who had somehow tracked her to their remote valley. He crept closer, calculating distances and angles, knowing he needed to reach the house and his rifle before the situation deteriorated further. "Dr. Whitmore treated a lot of patients in Denver," Magdalene said carefully. "I can't be expected to remember everyone." "Oh, but you should remember me," Morrison said, dismounting with deliberate slowness. "Especially considering what happened to that medical supplies warehouse fire back in '69. The one where certain valuable drugs went missing right before the building burned down." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face as he understood the implication. These men were accusing Magdalene of theft, possibly connected to the chaotic period during the cholera epidemic, when medical supplies were desperately scarce and people did whatever was necessary to survive. Emma pressed closer to Magdalene's side, sensing the adult tension even if she didn't understand its source. Magdalene's protective instincts were clearly warring with her fear as she calculated options for keeping the child safe. "I don't know what you're suggesting," Magdalene said, "but you're mistaken. My husband was a respected physician who never took anything that didn't belong to him." "Maybe not your husband," Morrison agreed, "but what about his grieving widow? What about a woman who suddenly had access to valuable medicines and the connections to sell them? What about someone who disappeared from Denver right after that convenient fire?" Thomas realized with growing horror that these men weren't just making random accusations. They had specific information, whether true or fabricated, that could destroy Magdalene's reputation and potentially involve her in criminal charges. The isolation that had protected her from painful memories had also left her vulnerable to people who might exploit her past. "Even if what you're suggesting were true," Magdalene said, her voice gaining strength, "it would be a matter for legal authorities, not for private confrontation." Morrison's smile was predatory. "Legal authorities might be interested. That's true, but we might be persuaded to forget what we know for the right price. A woman with your medical knowledge could earn good money treating people who prefer to avoid official attention." The threat was now explicit. These men wanted to force Magdalene into providing medical services for illegal activities, using blackmail and intimidation to ensure her cooperation. Thomas knew he had to act before the situation escalated beyond talking. He broke cover and sprinted toward the house, calling out as he ran, "Magdalene, get Emma inside, now." The sudden appearance of an armed and determined husband changed the dynamics immediately. Morrison's hand moved toward his gun, but Thomas was already in motion, his father's rifle within reach and 15 years of hunting experience, guiding his movements. Emma's school essay lay open on the kitchen table, her careful handwriting telling the story of her family in the simple, honest words that only children could manage. "My family" was written across the top in her best penmanship, and below it she had described the day a little girl asked a mountain woman to take her father, and how that request had grown into the most wonderful thing that had ever happened to any of them. Magdalene read the essay with tears in her eyes, while Thomas stood guard at the window, his rifle close at hand despite the departure of Morrison and his companions 3 hours earlier. The confrontation had ended without violence, but only because Doc Brennan and 2 neighboring ranchers had arrived in response to Thomas's signal shots, fired into the air. The would-be blackmailers had retreated when faced with multiple armed men who clearly supported the Sullivan family, but their threats lingered like smoke in the air. "She writes about feeling safe now," Magdalene said, her voice trembling as she read Emma's innocent words. "About having a complete family and knowing that someone will always be there to take care of her." The irony was bitter. Just as Emma was expressing her security and happiness, the very foundation of their family was being threatened by people who wanted to exploit Magdalene's past for their own criminal purposes. "They'll be back," Thomas said grimly, his eyes scanning the approaches to their property. "Men like that don't give up easily, especially when they think they've found a profitable opportunity." Magdalene set down the essay and moved to stand beside him at the window. "I should leave," she said quietly. "Take the danger away from you and Emma. If I disappear again, they'll follow me and leave you both alone." "No." Thomas's response was immediate and firm. "We're a family now. Whatever threats we face them together. But Emma's safety depends on keeping our family intact." Thomas interrupted. "She's lost one mother already. I won't let her lose another. Not to fear and not to people who want to destroy what we've built here." From upstairs came the sound of Emma moving around in her room, oblivious to the adult conversation below. She was probably arranging her few toys and treasures, content in the knowledge that her world was secure and her family was complete. The thought of shattering that innocence made both adults feel physically ill. "Morrison was lying about some of it," Magdalene said finally. "Charles never stole medical supplies, and neither did I. But during the cholera outbreak, when people were dying faster than we could treat them, I did take supplies from the hospital without proper authorization. I thought saving lives was more important than paperwork. Thomas turned to look at her, seeing the guilt and fear she'd been carrying for 15 years. What kind of supplies? Morphine, mostly, for patients who were suffering with no hope of recovery. The hospital administrators were rationing it to preserve supplies, but I couldn't watch people die in agony when relief was available. That's not theft, Thomas said firmly. That's mercy. The law might not see it that way, Magdalene replied. And Morrison knows enough to make his accusations sound credible. He probably has connections to people who were involved in black market medical supply sales during the epidemic. The complexity of the situation was overwhelming. Even if Magdalene's actions had been morally justified, proving that in a court of law would be difficult, especially with 15 years of distance and the chaos of that period, making documentation scarce. There has to be another way, Thomas said, his mind working through possibility. People who know your character, who can testify to your integrity. Dr. Brennan, Magdalene said suddenly. He would have been practicing during the epidemic. He might know other doctors who remember what conditions were like, who could explain why unusual measures were sometimes necessary. The sound of approaching horses sent both of them to the window again, but this time the visitors were friends. Dr. Brennan had returned with the territorial sheriff, a grizzled man named William Hayes, who had a reputation for fairness and practical common sense. Emma appeared at the top of the stairs, drawn by the voices and activity. "What's happening?" she asked, her school essay clutched in her hand. Magdalene climbed the stairs to meet her, taking the essay and wrapping the child in a protective embrace. "Just some grown-up business that we need to sort out," she said gently. "But nothing that will change our family." As she spoke the words, Magdalene prayed they would prove true. The essay in her hands described a little girl's complete happiness and security, feelings that were worth fighting for regardless of the cost or complexity involved in preserving them. Outside, Sheriff Hayes was already taking statements and asking questions that would determine whether their peaceful life could continue or whether the shadows of the past would finally claim the future they'd worked so hard to build. The sound of hammering echoed across the valley as Thomas and his neighbors worked to complete the addition to the farmhouse before the first heavy snows arrived. The new rooms would accommodate their growing family, with a proper nursery adjacent to the master bedroom, and an expanded kitchen that could handle the increased cooking and canning that Magdalene's thriving medical practice required. Sheriff Hayes had concluded his investigation 3 weeks earlier, determining that Morrison's accusations were based on distorted half-truths and criminal intent rather than legitimate grievance. Brennan's testimony about medical conditions during the cholera epidemic, combined with character witnesses from Denver who remembered both Charles and Magdalene Whitmore with respect, had thoroughly discredited the blackmail attempt. "The men who threatened you have outstanding warrants in 3 territories, Sheriff Hayes had reported with satisfaction. They won't be bothering anyone in these parts again." Now, as Thomas fitted the last board into place on the nursery wall, he marveled at how completely their lives had transformed from the desperate struggle of just 1 year ago. The crisis had actually strengthened their community standing as neighbors rallied to support them, and the truth about Magdalene's past emerged as evidence of her compassion rather than criminal behavior. Emma appeared in the doorway of the new room, her arms full of wildflowers she'd gathered for decorating the addition. At 8 years old, she had taken on the role of big sister with enthusiasm that delighted both parents. "Mama says the baby might come before the snow flies," she announced, arranging her flowers in a jar she'd claimed from the kitchen. "I hope it's a girl so I can teach her all the things you and Mama taught me." Thomas smiled at his daughter's confidence and excitement. The pregnancy had been a surprise that became a joy, proof that their family could continue growing and changing in ways they'd never dared to imagine during the difficult early years. Magdalene appeared in the doorway, her hand resting on the gentle curve that was just beginning to show beneath her work dress. At 38, she had worried about the risks of pregnancy, but Dr. Brennan's examinations showed everything progressing normally, and her mountain-hardened constitution seemed well suited to the demands of childbearing. "The community meeting went well," she reported, settling carefully into the chair. Thomas had placed near the window. "They've approved the proposal for a formal medical clinic, with you serving as official midwife and general practitioner for the valley." The irony wasn't lost on any of them. The same community leaders who had questioned the propriety of their living arrangement were now actively courting Magdalene's medical expertise, offering to build a proper clinic and provide official recognition of her skills. Miss Abernathy was particularly enthusiastic. Magdalene continued with barely suppressed amusement. Apparently her opinion of unconventional arrangements has evolved considerably since her grandson broke his arm and needed emergency treatment. Thomas finished securing the last board and stepped back to admire their work. The addition doubled the size of their living space and provided room for both family growth and Magdalene's expanding practice. More importantly, it represented their commitment to staying in this valley, to building something permanent rather than just surviving. The Peterson farm came up for sale again. Thomas mentioned, wiping sawdust from his hands. "Jim thinks we should consider buying it, now that we're in a position to expand our own operation." The Peterson property adjoined theirs and included some of the best farmland in the valley. Combined with their existing acreage, it would create a substantial holding that could support their family comfortably while providing employment for other valley residents. "It seems strange to think about expansion, when a year ago I was worried about keeping our original 40 acres, Thomas mused. Emma looked up from her flower arrangement with the wisdom that had become her trademark. "Papa, remember when I asked Magdalene to take you? I knew things would get better. I just didn't know how much better." The simple truth of her observation struck both adults with fresh appreciation for the child whose bold request had set everything in motion. Emma had seen possibilities that the adults had been too frightened or proud to recognize, and her innocent wisdom had proven more valuable than any amount of careful planning or conventional approach to their problems. Outside, the mountain peaks were beginning to show the first dustings of early snow, marking the approach of winter and the completion of their first full year as a family. The challenges of the past months had tested and strengthened their bonds, proving that what they'd built together could withstand external threats and internal doubts. As evening approached and the work crew prepared to leave, Thomas stood in their expanded home with his wife and daughter, feeling the deep satisfaction of a man who had found his place in the world and the courage to fight for it. The hand-carved cradle rocked gently beside the kitchen window where morning light could warm the tiny occupant, while Magdalene worked at her daily tasks. Thomas had spent the last month of her pregnancy crafting the cradle from mountain pine, carving intricate designs of wildflowers and mountain peaks into its sides, creating something that would serve their family for generations to come. Baby Sarah Elizabeth Sullivan had arrived during the first snowfall of winter, as if she wanted to mark her entrance into the world with the same dramatic timing that had characterized her parents' courtship. Now, 6 weeks later, she slept peacefully in her father's handiwork, while her mother prepared the morning meal and her sister Emma got ready for school. "She's getting bigger every day," Emma observed, pausing in her breakfast preparations to peer into the cradle. "Brennan says she's the healthiest baby he's delivered this year." Magdalene smiled at Emma's proud reporting of medical opinions. At 8 years old, Emma had appointed herself assistant nursemaid and took her responsibilities with characteristic seriousness. She helped with feeding schedules, entertained the baby during fussy periods, and served as an extra pair of eyes during the busy times when Magdalene was treating patients. Thomas entered the kitchen carrying firewood and wearing the expression of deep contentment that had become his normal demeanor since Sarah's birth. Fatherhood the second time around was proving even more rewarding than the first, partly because he was older and more confident, but mostly because he was sharing the experience with someone who understood and supported his efforts. "The Peterson property papers are ready for signing," he announced, setting the wood by the stove. "The bank approved our loan application, and Jim's eager to complete the sale before spring planting season." The purchase of the adjoining farm would more than double their acreage and establish them as one of the larger operations in the valley. More importantly, it would provide security for their expanding family and create opportunities for Emma and Sarah as they grew older. "Miss Sean stopped by yesterday while you were working," Magdalene reported, stirring the morning porridge. "She wanted to know if we'd consider letting her daughter help with the clinic once school lets out for summer." Apparently, young Lynn has expressed interest in learning medical skills. The clinic had become a central institution in the valley, with Magdalene serving as the region's primary medical practitioner and Thomas managing the business aspects of the operation. Their success had inspired other young people to consider careers in healing, creating opportunities for knowledge transfer that extended beyond their own family. Emma finished her breakfast and gathered her school materials, pausing to kiss her baby sister's forehead before heading toward the door. "Tell her about the new words she learned yesterday," she instructed Magdalene with 8-year-old authority. "What new word?" Thomas asked, settling into his chair with his coffee and a pleased expression. "She started making different sounds for different needs," Magdalene explained, lifting Sarah from the cradle and settling her against her shoulder. "One cry for hunger, another for discomfort, and yesterday she made a happy gurgling sound when Emma was playing with her." The baby chose that moment to demonstrate her expanding vocabulary, producing a series of contented sounds that made both parents smile with the foolish pride of people completely besotted with their offspring. Thomas looked around their expanded kitchen, taking in the evidence of their transformed circumstances. The shelves were well stocked with preserved foods from their abundant garden. The medicine cabinet held professional supplies for Magdalene's practice. The family Bible sat prominently on the sideboard, its pages now recording not just their marriage and Emma's adoption, but also Sarah's birth and the beginning of what promised to be many more family milestones. "Do you ever think about that day at the supply exchange?" Thomas asked, watching Emma disappear down the path toward school. When she made her request to Magdalene. "Every day," Magdalene replied, gently rocking Sarah while she spoke. "I think about how brave she was, and how wise. She saw solutions that we couldn't see, possibilities that we were too frightened to consider. She saved us all," Thomas said simply. A 7-year-old child who decided that asking for help was better than watching her father struggle alone. Through the window they could see the valley stretching toward the mountains, the landscape that had witnessed their unlikely courtship and improbable success. Snow-covered peaks stood sentinel over the community that had initially questioned their arrangement, but now celebrated their contribution to valley life. As Sarah dozed in her mother's arms and Thomas prepared for another day of work on their expanded property, both parents felt the deep satisfactions of people who had found their place in the world through the simple wisdom of a child who believed that taking care of each other was the most natural thing in the world.